Welcome to Sinful's Horror Stories. Tonight's video features true scary babysitting stories. Sit back, relax, stay sinful. I was about 13 or 14, and I was babysitting two boys for some church members. I had done it before, and the kids loved me, and the parents were very comfortable with me. This was the night they were going to be gone until 2:30 in the morning. I was doing it for free that day because they were going to do something church-related, and that's just how I rolled. Anyway, the house I lived in was an apartment complex. You know, one of those small ones that had 2 floors and 4 places in each spot. They were on the bottom floor, with 2 bedrooms on either side of the apartment, with a kitchen on the left and the living room on the right, with the sliding glass door to a small patio and a public bathroom next to the front door. I think it was about 1:30 a.m., and I knew they would be getting home soon. The kids were knocked out, obviously after practically begging and 3 bedtime stories. I finished my homework and they didn't have cable, so I watched a couple of DVDs to pass the time. I was already very tired and had nodded off a few times. At about 2 a.m. I could hear knocking on the front door. Knowing the parents had a key, I did nothing but sit there in the dark with the TV glowing. Being a paranoid person, and someone who watches and reads enough horror, I grabbed a baseball bat that was next to the couch. And what happened next will haunt me forever. I heard a small voice, almost like a young woman's. "Oh dear, that won't help you." My heart stopped and I realized the patio door didn't have the blinds shut. My eyes shift slowly to the door, and I see someone on the patio staring in. I couldn't make anything out other than that they were very short and wide. I screamed and ran into the kids' room. Thankfully, they were still asleep. Sadly, this was before I had a cell phone and there was no cordless phones. All I did was push the dresser in front of the door and stared out the window. That's when it became dark as a shadow loomed out the window. The knocking started again and the woman's voice called out, "Come on, dearie. I won't hurt you. Please come out." The window was being knocked on so hard I was afraid it would break. The kids finally woke up and they were screaming and scared. I was a big girl and could at that time lift my own weight. But knowing I had 2 kids with me, I became vulnerable and afraid. Within the 2 seconds I hear the father yell out, "Hey, who the hell are you?" The person ran off. The front door opened and there was harsh knocking on the kids' bedroom door. Thankfully it was the parents, and after I let them in and put the dresser back, I explained what had happened, and they called the police. When they arrived, they obviously found nothing but the bushes that hide the patio had been cut up and ripped up to get through. I babysat for them once more after that, but after they moved about 5 months later, I never babysat for anyone, ever again. And again to this day, I know the woman was long gone, but every time I hear a knock, a chill runs through me. Stranger who was watching me, let's not meet again. Story number 2. 2 years ago, right around Halloween, I was babysitting for these 2 ladies who each had a son. They wanted to go out, so I stayed at one of their houses and watched their boys. It was around 8 p.m. and the boys were sitting on the couch, playing on their iPads and whatnot, when someone knocked on the door. I asked them if anyone was supposed to come over, and they both answered no. I go over and check the eye hole in the door, and it's some guy in a gray hoodie, deliberately hunched over so I can't see his face. Immediately I'm like, nope, and don't say anything. Start pacing around because I don't want to give any inclination we're inside. A couple minutes later, I check outside the little window through the curtains, and he's gone. I didn't want to spook the kids anymore, and there weren't any more knocks, so I just kind of let it go as a prank. Cut to a few hours later, and the moms get back. They ask me how everything was, and I say the kids were great, but somebody had come to the door. They asked me what time, and I said around 8, and one of the moms starts freaking out and going through her phone. The other one tells me that right around that time, somebody had been making strange calls to them on a blocked number. They had disguised their voice and were saying things like, "I can see you through your window." They didn't think it was serious because it didn't make sense in the context of where they were. But in retrospect, we're almost positive it was me he was looking through at the window. They escorted me to my car and I touched base later, and apparently nothing strange ever happened after that. But I'm really just glad I didn't open that door, because I have a feeling in my gut it would have been really, really bad. Story number 3. I don't even know where to start this story. I was kind of young at the time, around 7 or 8, but old enough to know what was going on. I lived in a pretty decent neighborhood, but my family was in the process of moving. There was a large mixture of families with children and retired seniors living on my street. There was a neighborhood babysitter who took care of my younger sister when she was too young to go to school. She also happened to babysit me on multiple occasions. She was always kind of rude, a pudgy lady with 2 annoying sons and a very weird husband. A lot of kids got taken care of by her, so my parents trusted her to take care of us. Everything was somewhat normal, except for the fact that she was kind of rude to anybody that wasn't her kid. Her kids were pretty misbehaved. They were always fighting, hitting each other with plastic swords, and screaming at the top of their lungs. At one point, the young toddlers had a nap and she forced all of the children to sit in a corner and be quiet, besides her kids. Very odd behavior for a babysitter, but we never thought much of it. Another thing to mention is that she took naps while babysitting. As in, she didn't pay attention to the kids, she just shooed them away and fell asleep. She was also notorious for giving her sons chocolate milk and telling others they had to have water. My sister and I tried to ignore it, but eventually we were kind of annoyed. My sister had a loud mouth, so she told my mom about how she treats the kids she babysits versus her own kids. I'd also like to acknowledge that my sister had just turned 4, so she wasn't great with words. My mom was angry that the babysitter did that, but let it slide as we were moving in a month, and she didn't know if we were being completely honest. The house we moved to is a house I spent a large majority of my childhood and teen years in. Things were normal once we transitioned into the new house, until we got the calls. We changed our phone numbers, so we weren't sure how the babysitter and her husband found out so quickly. She called every day saying that we needed to pay her, and that we owed her money. She was just angry that we had moved and were currently on the lookout for a babysitter that was closer to our place. My parents received these calls every day, and they consisted of the babysitter or her husband screaming, which meant that I could hear the voicemail's calls quite clearly. The harassment continued and my parents grew agitated and extremely worried. It all ended one night at around 10 p.m. when my sister and I woke up to the sound of banging on the front door. It continued for 10 minutes and it was so loud. My sister was freaked out, so I decided to go to see if my parents were awake. They were. They were just opening their eyes, kind of confused as to what was going on. My dad told my mom to stay upstairs and he foolishly went downstairs to get the door. As I stood at the railing nervously, my sister stayed in her room because she was unaware to what was actually going on. When he opened the door, I felt sick and terrified. There was a babysitter and her husband, who managed to find not only our address, but also our phone number. The husband started screaming at the top of his lungs, yelling, "You owe us money. Pay us," and shaking a knife in my father's face. Yes, he had a knife in his hand. My dad told him that we didn't and warned him to leave unless he wanted the cops to be called. He didn't care. My dad went to close the door, but he stuck his foot in it, attempting to get inside. My babysitter was also yelling, but I couldn't hear what she said. We had a phone upstairs, so my mother quietly called the police as my dad struggled to get the door closed. Once he did, the banging and screaming continued. They wouldn't leave our property. I was so freaked out that I started crying. My sister saw me crying and she did the same. Long story short, in about an hour later, they left, and the cops arrived having just missed them. My parents knew their info based on the fact that they babysat us, so it wasn't hard to track them, and then they were arrested. I always wondered if their children were home alone or at a sleepover, especially at a time so late. Regardless, they were released a few days later, but were not allowed to step foot near our house. I'm not sure if the woman still babysits, but if she does, I feel terrible for those kids. We never really knew what their intentions were that night. My dad saw the knife and they knew they were up to no good. All I can say is, psychotic babysitter and her husband, let's never meet again. Ever. Story number 4. I was maybe 8 years old, and one day our elderly neighbor was babysitting me because my parents were away for the day. I lived in a tiny, safe suburban town, but I had a serious fear of ghosts, the dark, and strangers. That day, a young, well-dressed guy knocked on the front door, which opens to the living room where I was playing Xbox. My babysitter answers it and he sounds kind of shady for some reason. He just says, "I see your son has an Xbox," and then says, "Are the parents here?" When she says she's not my mom, she says no, and then he just says he'll come back later. I thought it felt weird for some reason, but he was gone, so I stopped worrying. Fast forward to a few days later, my parents leave me home alone for some reason. The phone rings, and I decide not to answer it because I never did when alone. The guy leaves a voicemail and says he's from our town bureau. He said something like, "Be aware there has been a string of robberies in the neighborhood. The suspects are a young man and woman dressed well. One knocks on the door and chats while the others sneak around. And I don't remember whatever after that, because I had already frozen in terror. I spent the rest of the day and night sitting by my front window with all the doors double locked, with the phone in hand ready to dial 911. The only thing that kept me feeling safe was that the police station was literally a block away, but I didn't know how calling the police even worked. Seeing my parents' car roll up was the sweetest relief of my life. I don't know what happened to the robbers, but I didn't hear of them in our neighborhood ever again. I rarely do this, but as an added bonus, I thought I would just share a story that I experienced as a child when I was being babysat. I remember I think I was 5 or 6 years old, maybe 7 at the most. My parents were both at work for the day. I had an elderly woman named Helen who was a very sweet, nice, kind lady. She was somehow a family friend when I was growing up. My dad worked about an hour from home, and my mom worked about 10 minutes from home. It was a dark, rainy day from what I can recall. We were sitting watching cartoons, and we had a knock at the door. Helen got up to answer the door, and from what I could see peeking from around the couch, it was 2 men. One man was wearing a long trench coat and had sunglasses on. The other man was a taller man. He was very slender and had a beard and was unkempt. Helen asked what she could do for them. Is the child's father home? As I think about it now at the age of 33, what could that have actually meant? I would have to say the scariest part of that interaction was when I looked from around the couch. I locked eyes with one of the men, and he peered down at me and smiled. Helen closed the door very quickly, and the men decided to leave. They walked down our stairs, took a left down the sidewalk, and were out of sight. I don't know why that story stuck with me, but it just reminds me of what people could really be up to. Thank you guys for listening and watching this video. Please be sure to leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe for future content. I hope everyone had a wonderful week, and until we meet again, stay sinful.